All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmidt, and today we have two very special guests on. All my guests are usually special, but these guests are particularly special. So we got Dr. J.C. Beall and Mike DeVito. So for those of you who don't know, Dr. Beall is a professor at Notre Dame. He works a lot on logic, philosophy of logic, the liar paradox, subclassical, non-classical logic, all that sorts of fun stuff, as well as other work. And then Mike DeVito is a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, yes. And he's working a lot on the problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom and kind of applying James Anderson's rational affirmation of paradoxical theology to that, as well as non-classical and subclassical logic to that. So that's what he's writing his dissertation on. So today we're just going to be talking about contradictions in theology and paradox in theology and everything along those lines. So I'm super excited for that. And yeah, thank you guys both for coming on. I guess we should probably start with asking what is logic, because a lot of people in our audience might not know what that is. So I'll turn it over to JC to start with that.
Yeah, so the term logic is used in a lot of different ways, and I don't think that there can be fruitful discussion unless a person makes precise exactly the sense in which they're using the term. Logic, of course, is a field of inquiry, has various subfields for those interested. Oxford Scholarship Online, John Burgess and I did a short piece for them, sort of spelling out all the subfields and what they are. I won't go into that here. Some people think of logic as sort of the way you ought to reason. I think that that's not what it is. I mean, if you should reason according to logic, whatever that would mean, and I have no idea what that would mean, you wouldn't get very far. You certainly wouldn't believe that you're listening to a podcast or whatever we call these things. I mean, what logical principles are going to give you that? So I don't think it's about how you should reason. What rational acceptance and rational rejection is about. Gilbert Harmon, who recently passed away, wrote a book called Change in View. And while it's very simplistic in some of the distinctions, I think it's spot on. He basically says that, you know, when many people use the term logic, they're thinking a theory of reasoning or rational acceptance rejection behavior. And he said, that's just not what it is. Logic as logical validity, as a relation on sentences or propositions, however you like to talk, this is a what's called a monotonic sort of thing. Don't worry about that term. It just means that if you've got a valid argument, then adding to the premises won't change the validity. As Harmon pointed out, one obvious way in which how you should reason differs from logic is that how you should reason is very non-monotonic. Change the information input, and that changes everything as far as what you should do, what you should infer, what you should reject. Okay, so let's sort of get that off the board. But if logic doesn't have anything to do with, well, I don't want to say it has nothing to do with, but if it's not principally about rational ways of reasoning, then what is it? I think that logic is one of many entailment relations. So, you know, some sentences entail other sentences. That Joe is wearing a blue hood sweater, I don't know, whatever it is, entails that he's wearing something colored. Okay, what does entailment mean? It means that there's no relevant possibility in which Joe's wearing a blue sweater is true and not wearing something colored. But of course, now you can ask, well, is there only one entailment relation or many on a given language? I think it's pretty obvious that there are many. And the question for logic is, which relation is logical entailment? The answer that I think is traditional and the right answer is that it's the sort of foundational one that governs the sparse logical vocabulary, things like logical conjunction, logical disjunction, logical negation, and the first order quantifiers for all and for some. That's pretty much it. So that basic tiny little set of topic neutral vocabulary is the logical vocabulary, and logical entailment is what governs that vocabulary. And I think the best way of thinking about logic, where I use that as shorthand for logical consequence, logical entailment, logical validity, is to think of it as the entailment relation at the very bottom of the entailment relation in any true theory. So all true theories have to obey logic in the sense that the logical entailment relation governs them. But of course, a theory of biology will also have more entailment going on. Theory of arithmetic or groups or something like this will have different entailments built on top of logical. So that's a lot of information at once, but I think the important idea is logical consequence is the relation that's involved in the entailment relation of any true theory whatsoever. That's why traditionally it's been called topic neutral, universal, because it governs all true theories. So if logical entailment validates something, if something's logically valid, then it's going to be valid in all true theories. That doesn't hold for other entailment relations. If something entails something else in the correct theory of metaphysical necessity, that doesn't mean that that entailment goes through in all true theories. For one boring reason, many true theories, like the true theory of arithmetic or set theory, don't have any vocabulary dealing with metaphysical necessity or anything like that. Okay, so that's a bunch of information. You can ask follow-up if I wasn't clear.
And just the note too, Joe, for your listeners, if they're interested in sort of logic being monotonic and reasoning being non-monotonic and how that relates to everything, JC's paper, Free of Detachment, was it Free of Detachment, JC?
Yeah, Free of Detachment.
That was I mean, that's one of my top 3 favorite philosophy papers, and that really makes those points clear. So I won't harp on it, but anybody that's interested, that's a great resource for everything JC was just talking about.
Sweet. Okay, just one quick follow-up question. So when we talk about a theory, is that basically just like a collection of sentences closed under entailment? Is that what you're thinking?
That's correct. So you can think of a theory in 2 ways. I kind of think of them as a theory as just a set of sentences. This is what you might call a seed theory or something. You know, as you're trying to get the true and complete theory of a particular phenomenon, you're adding truths to it. But then to get the full thing, it has to be closed under some entailment relation. And all that means is for the given entailment relation, if you have a sentence or proposition, doesn't matter, in a theory, closed under that entailment relation, if that sentence is in there and that sentence entails, according to the given relation, some other sentence, then that other sentence is in there too already. That's what it is to be closed under an entailment relation. So yeah, that's right, Joe.
All right, sweet. So now we can move on to, so we've covered what logic is, and now we can talk about what non-classical or subclassical logic is. And Mike, I'm actually going to turn it over to you to start, laying the groundwork. And if JC wants to add anything to that, he can feel free to do so. So Michael, what is non-classical or subclassical logic? And also, why is it called non-classical or subclassical logic?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you came to me because JC, probably would have fumbled this one. So it's good that you came to me to talk about non-classical and subclassical logic. Yeah. What is non-classical logic? Well, first off, why is it called that? It's interesting to, and JC has talked about this a bunch, how classical logic really isn't classical, right? So you deal a lot with classical theism, and that we're talking about, going all the way back to the beginning of Christianity. Classical logic isn't like that, right? I mean, this is something that was developed by mathematicians about 100 years ago, and wasn't always the sort of standard account. It just became something that, or it was originally developed as something for mathematics, which JC will talk about, is most philosophers of logic, I think, believe to be a consistent theory where classical logic or the standard account of logic applies. But it was in no way meant to be at least, and JC, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was in no way meant to be a underlying account of logical entailment that accounts for all of our metaphysical theories, right? I mean, it really was just designed for math. So non-classical logic or subclassical logic is going to weaken, is going to say, listen, our underlying account of logical consequence, right? Our underlying entailment relation that closes all of our true theories is going to be weaker than what classical logic says it is. So it's going to allow for more phenomena in our metaphysics. And so that would be, it depends on how weak you want to go. I have my FDE shirt on, so I'll go down far, but you can go paraconsistent, right? And say, okay, there are these phenomena out there that are true contradictions, right? That where the object will fall in both the extension and the anti-extension of the predicate. So basically saying, simply saying, the law of non-contradiction is not in all places valid. There are some phenomena out there that things are both true and false of. And then you have paracomplete, which says there are gaps. So there can be an object that is neither in the extension or anti-extension of a predicate. So there are certain phenomena where things are neither true nor false of these things. And so I know, working on future contingents, a lot of philosophers have talked about, and maybe not spelled out the semantics of it as in as much detail as necessary until recently with Patrick Todd's stuff, but talked about how future contingents are neither true nor false, right? And this is one way to resolve the problem of future contingents, the problem of foreknowledge, things like that. So it's just a weaker account of, and then FDE is both paraconsistent and paracomplete. So FDE, first degree entailment, is going to say our underlying account of logical consequence is going to allow for both gluts, things that are both true and false, and gaps, things that are neither true nor false. I'm probably butchering it though. JC, is that
No, I don't think so. I would add just a couple things, not corrections so much as clarifications. One is that you had said that classical logic, what is taught today, called classical logic, which is the standard account of logic. It's sort of it was the first cab off the block, and that's just what people keep doing, as if like they're learning Euclidean geometry or whatever. And then that's all they know. They never think about it. They think, oh, okay, yeah, right, okay, good. But one thing you said was it was built for standard mathematics, mathematical theories, true mathematical theories. I just want to clarify that I think what you meant there was that when Russell, Whitehead, Frege, all mathematicians trying to formulate classical logic, so-called what we call classical logic, they were actually looking at how the logical vocabulary behaves in true mathematics. So it's a description of the entailment behavior of logical vocabulary in true mathematics. It wasn't like a tool built to use in that. It was actually a descriptive project. And as Mike said, which never gets it never gets taught. I don't know why. It may be that instructors don't know. You know, Russell, Whitehead, Frege, none of them, I can't imagine any of them thought that because the logical vocabulary behaves this way in true mathematics, that's the way it behaves in all true theories. I mean, that's an egregious fallacy, especially in the face of, as Mike said, whether it's vagueness or theological or physical or whatever the problem cases are, that would be an egregious fallacy to make.
Yeah, that's good. And I always fall into, like, I just now fell into that trap, right? Where it's like, this has been really helpful for me as I work through this, and JC's, you know, been really gracious, you know, holding my hand as we go through this stuff. But you even fall back. I mean, we're so used to classical logic sort of running the show that it's like, we look at our metaphysics, and if we see this stuff that doesn't work, doesn't fit, you know, we might say, oh, you know, this looks contradictory. Well, that can't be true, right? Because logic doesn't allow that to be true. And what JC is saying, and where I sort of slipped up was with Frege and them, that they're looking at the theory to tell them what the underlying account of logical consequence is, not the other way around. And I feel like, and we'll get into this, this has sort of been one of the issues when talking about this within theology is, and especially apologetics, theology, philosophy, religion, is we look at the theories and we find something that's contradictory and automatically say, well, logic doesn't allow that. So we have to cram this metaphysics into our logic. And correct me if I'm wrong, JC, but I feel like that's the wrong methodology. We should be looking at the metaphysics to determine, okay, how is the world? What is the world really like? And that's going to determine how weak our underlying account of logical consequences. Is that kind of right, JC? No?
Yeah. I mean, I mean, people who think that what's this very recent so-called classical logic is like stands on really solid grounds or something, I mean, are just I'm sure that they're very reflective and smart people, but I mean, it's just uninformed. I mean, if you ask them, well, what are the grounds, you'll quickly see that the grounds are just not very strong. That doesn't mean that therefore it has to be wrong as the universal entailment relation in all true theories. But the thought that this is so clear and, well, I mean, is just uninformed, but it's a hard thing. You try to get at the truth. And that's a messy thing, whether it's a truth about logic or metaphysics or anything else. It's a you know, the old sort of Neurath's boat thing where, you know, you're rebuilding your raft at sea. I mean, that's really our situation. And it's not like logic is this like, you know, it's the one thing that you can always cling to, and you know for sure that this won't sink, or you know, and I mean, that's just, no, it's all there. It's you're trying to get the true account of whatever it is you're trying to get. It's a hard thing. It's not like, well, you take logic and you march out there, and no, I mean, it's harder than that.
Yeah. All right. So just a few clarifications. Well, one question and a few clarifications. So the question, I can't believe I forgot this in the intro. I'm sorry, Mike, but I should have mentioned that the reason you are so buff, you know, we got this philosopher who's like this incredibly buff philosopher here. Part of the reason why that is because before your academic career, you played 9 seasons in the NFL with the New York Jets and the Kansas City Chiefs. So I guess I just have to quickly ask, who was the best or perhaps most well-known quarterback that you sacked? So the audience just has to get a kind of mental break and know this.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of like our discussion here, right? I'm with one of the world's greatest philosophers, one of the soon-to-be world's greatest philosophers, and I'm just trying, I'm about as valuable to this conversation as I was on the football field on third down, okay? Because I was a run-stopping, 320-pound, unathletic white dude who's just holding up double teams. But I did get a couple of chances to be out there on third down to make some plays, and I sacked Phillip Rivers, I sacked Ben Roethlisberger, but probably the most famous sort of sack that I had was Peyton Manning. I sacked Peyton.
Nice,
So, yeah,
nice.
That felt good. I never got Tom Brady. I hit him so many. I played Tom Brady 13 or 14 times, and I hit him so many times, but I was never able to sack him. And I told my wife, I said, if I would have ever sacked Tom Brady, I live up here in New England and Maine, I would have a mural on the front of my house of me sacking Tom Brady, you know? So great. I think she's happy that never happened. But yeah, no, that's, yeah, now I'm trying to transition to the academic world. And boy, I thought football was hard. And then I got in here and I'm like, wow, this is a lot harder.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, I'm glad we got to cover that. Okay, now for the clarifications. So first, we've thrown out some terms, and I just want to make these explicit for the audience. So we've used the terms extension and anti-extension. So as I understand it, we're talking about predicates here. So a predicate like is blue or is red, things like that, is a human. And the extension of a predicate is just all and only those things of which the predicate is true. And then the anti-extension is those things of which it isn't true, essentially. So
well, it's the anti-extension is the set of all and only the things of which the predicate is false.
Okay, that's a good clarification.
See, the problem is, I think traditionally both truth and falsity were the fundamental properties of sentences. But in theories like true mathematics, where the logical vocabulary does behave classically, at least according to many, including myself, although Zach Weber, a very good philosopher, logician at University of Otago, he firmly disagrees. Likewise, Chris Mortensen at Adelaide. Anyway, in those theories, of course, when truth and falsity are mutually exclusive and exhaustive, then you can just say, well, you got true and then the rest, and you still get all sentences. But that's a result about classically closed theories. That's not some fundamental given about truth and falsity. So the bit where we all start is truth and falsity are fundamental properties, and those are the properties that sentence get to have by way of the exemplification relation with predicates. So a predicate can be true of you, it can be false of you. If it's true of you, then the sentence attributing that property to you is true. If the predicate's false of you, then the sentence attributing is false. So just to be clear, it's not like, so the extension is the set of all and only the things of which the predicate is true. The anti-extension is simply the set of all and only the things of which the predicate is false. Okay.
Yeah, and then subclassical and non-classical logic is going to allow for something to fall both in the extension and in the anti-extension of a predicate.
That's one direction for subclassical logic. That's right. That would be a pair-consistent direction. A pair-complete, which allows for gaps, as Mike said, would allow the set of all things of which predicate is true, the set of all things of which it's false, to not be exhaustive. There can be things in the domain, things that exist, of which the predicate is neither true nor false.
All right. And so that then clarifies the next two things that I just wanted to get explicit for the audience, which was gap and glut. So glut, both true and false, gap, neither true nor false.
Correct.
All right. No, it's all good. No, it's perfectly fine.
I get nervous and just get going, you know. So.
No, it's good. Okay, so just one last thing before we turn on to contradictions in theology. And this is sort of just allaying all the fears of the common folk with respect to contradictions, true contradictions, and so on. So I don't know precisely how to put it, but like, why don't we get, why once we allow, as it were, true contradictions, why don't we get this kind of like Why doesn't everything explode? Why doesn't anything go? Aren't we like gutted of, I guess that's kind of, no, that's glutted. Okay, no, never mind. Aren't we gutted of the use of reductio ad absurdum? Like, how are we supposed to even be able to evaluate theories? So that's a number of worries, and maybe we could just, for the next 5 or 10 minutes, allay these worries that people have. So I'll turn it over to you, JC.
Well, those are at least two different questions. The first question is one that says, well, if there are some gluts, some entities of which some predicate is both true and false, then why aren't there many? Well, there's one, there's one natural number that's between -1 and 1. Why aren't there many? If we can have one, why can't we have many? That's one thing to say. But to see the fallacy in general, it's like, well, if one little bit of reality is a bit weird, then why isn't all of reality weird? Well, I don't know, but why would you think so? Like, it's hard for me to understand why people think this. And it's like, suppose you have a set of sentences, 5 sentences, one of which is false and 4 are true. And somebody says, well, if we can have one false one, why aren't the rest false? It's like, why would you? It's not how you go about figuring out what's true and false. It's like, it's just strange to me. If there's more to it, Joe, I would love to hear it. I never have though. People say that, and then, I mean, but they don't apply that same monumentally sort of fallacious step to other things. And I can't figure out what it is about this that somehow makes them think that's not a fallacy. Okay, the other question was, what about reductio? Well, that's right. Reductio is an important method of on sort of rational acceptance rejection behavior, reasoning. And then there's a formal representation of forms of reductio according to an entailment relation. Okay, these are very different things. I think that if you have no good reason to think that there's something relevantly, possibly contradictory going on in your domain of inquiry, then if you see a contradiction, you should think, okay, we've misstepped, and you go back. None of that is affected. Absolutely none of that is affected by recognizing that logical entailment allows for the logical possibility of gluts. I mean, so you can reason by reductio, you can infer by reductio, you can reject something on the grounds that you've accepted that there's a contradiction otherwise. All of that is fine. Does that always work across all of reality? No, but frankly, I know of very few principles governing rational acceptance rejection behavior that are exceptionless across reality. I don't know of any. Does that help?
I think it does. And I guess maybe before getting into like the contradictory theological things, we could probably just talk about some of these principles that are at least defeasible rules of thumb that guide us in theory selection. So, you know, you have like fit with data, explanatory power, simplicity, completeness. I know you've talked about that one. And so I'll just turn it over to you because, you know, you have sections in your book, the Contradictory Christ on this. So
yeah. So let me emphasize again that logic, qua logical consequence or logical validity, is a relation on the language of a true theory. Okay, it's just it's not in itself normative. Logical validity doesn't tell you to accept something, reject something. It just tells you this follows according to me from that. That's all it does. So just remind, but when we're pursuing the truth about reality, you know, we have to go by rules of thumb. And I generally list three methodological rules of thumb. One is that we want to pursue complete theories. We want the full truth about a given phenomenon. And in doing so, we want to aim to, for each sentence P in the language of your theory, you want either P to be true according to the theory or its logical negation. You want it to be false according to the theory. So that's the sort of pursuit of completeness, complete theories. You try to resolve for each sentence P in the language of the theory, either P or its logical negation, so that each sentence is either true or false according to the theory. That's the pursuit of completeness. There's also a pursuit of consistency. You try to, for each sentence in the language of the theory, you try never to put both P and its logical negation in there. You try to resolve exactly one. Then there's simplicity and naturalness. This one's harder to, it doesn't have a precise formulation in terms of sentences or anything, but it's more, you know, the more you pursue truth and take the time to precisely formulate theories. And then there's simplicity, naturalness. This doesn't have a precise formulation in terms of sentences of the language, but instead, this is something you sort of get a sense of the more you engage in pursuing truth. These three rules of thumb guide much of our rational inquiry. The question then is, you know, how much of reality is really going to allow the theories to satisfy all three of those rules of thumb? You know, I think a lot of philosophers have thought that vagueness, which is a very conspicuous phenomenon, that this pushes against the completeness rule of thumb. Maybe stuff about the future pushes against the completeness rule of thumb. I'm not arguing for any of that. I'm just saying, you know, and of course, you might have in the other direction, you might have certain phenomena that push against the consistency rule of thumb. Now, how do you resolve these? Well, it's not as if logic's going to tell you. It's not as if you're now going to have a meta rule of thumb that's going to tell you how to always resolve when not all three can be satisfied. You're not going to have some other rule that's going to tell you which to go. It's a case-by-case thing. And, you know, I don't think that logic demands, so I point to a simple case of, you know, liar paradox or truth theoretic paradoxes in general, because they're just very easy to understand. There's nothing special about them. They're not in any way tied to, you know, important inconsistent theories about other things, but they're easy. So take a sentence like the liar that says I'm false. You know, logic alone, on my view, doesn't demand that be true and false, because it doesn't demand that it be either true or false. It can be gappy. But it seems to me when you take into account the naturalness and beauty part of and simplicity part, it looks to me like this is a case that cries out for bucking the consistency rule of thumb and going for completeness, treating it as both true and false. It's a very natural, simple way to do it. So I think that these kind of rules are what govern our actual pursuit of truth and our actual reasoning. And so whatever the right account of logic is, it doesn't get in the way of these things. We still pursue. It's just, yeah. So independent of whether logic is subclassical or classical, well, if it were classical, then that would demand that all true theories be complete and consistent. I must say, it'll demand it, even as Tarski noted, at the cost of naturalness, simplicity, and in some ways, believability. I mean, Saul Kripke's well-known work on truth was basically responding to, I mean, this absolutely implausible thought that, you can't have a truth predicate unless it's like, in a gazillion different languages, none applying to themselves and all that stuff. But if the standard account of logic, the so-called classical account, is correct, you're forced into that, as Tarski proved, actually.
Yeah. And just a note on that too, Joe, and JC and I have been talking about this, and JC, you had the idea, I don't know if you added it to your new book, but another possible rule of thumb or maybe way to evaluate these problems and see when a subclassical solution might be applicable is historical persistency, right? So when you think of the foreknowledge and freedom problem, we've been at consistent, well, I mean, I guess, maybe not para-complete solutions have been put forth, but consistent solutions. We've been at this for how long now? Thousands of years, and we still haven't. I mean, even today, and I'll get into this when we talk about the papers. It seems like people have their different solutions to the foreknowledge and freedom problem, but it reminds me of the old quote, and I'm going to butcher it, about democracy, where democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other forms of government, right? So it's like
Winston Churchill.
I feel like that's how people feel about the sort of standard solutions to the foreknowledge and freedom problem. It's like, well, it's not great, but it's better than all the other ones. And so it's like, well, let's, maybe this is a time to open up and see if a para-consistent solution fits. So historical persistency could be an extra one to add in there.
Well, I do think that so what you're pointing out is, if normally we're guided by this completeness constraint on true theories, consistency constraint, and naturalness, whatever pushes back, and it's things like, Quine would call it recalcitrant data, just the persistence of a particular problem that everyone thinks, I can kind of see how that sort of solves it, but just the persistence of apparent contradiction, or the apparent need of gaps, the appearance of indeterminacy or something like this.
Yeah. All right, so now we're going to move on to the kind of section where we're really digging into the contradictory theology or philosophical theology, philosophy, religion, and so on. So just for the audience, to situate them, we have covered first what logic is, and more specifically, the subclassical or non-classical logic. We got into gaps and gluts and predicates and extensions and so on. And then we also gave some reasons for, why this isn't to be dismissed out of hand, why we should take this seriously. You've got phenomena such as vagueness and other sorts of things, and the persistence of trying to give consistent solutions, that all of which seem pretty iffy. So that's some reasons to take this seriously. And we also allayed some worries about theories which allow true contradictions. It doesn't destroy our reasoning altogether. No, it doesn't. We still have all these rules of thumb by which we evaluate theories, and we come to really get a true theory. So that is the kind of first part of our discussion. And now, like I said, we're moving on to contradictory theology. Now, JC, I know you've done already a lot on the incarnation, so maybe what we could do is just really briefly, you could spell out how you apply this to the incarnation, but we're not really going to dwell on that. And instead, we're going to focus on the Trinity, which is your forthcoming book with Oxford. And after that, we're going to be talking about the problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. So just briefly, if you can tell us what your project is or was with the incarnation, but let's focus primarily on the Trinity.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's what my colleague Richard Cross calls the fundamental problem of the doctrine of incarnation, which is the apparent contradiction of having exactly one person, both, fully divine and fully human, and therefore has all the limitlessness of being divine that's essential to being divine, and all of the limitations essential to being human. The accounts that are out there that try to resolve the contradiction do so by, in my view, bucking the simplicity and naturalness desideratum in serious ways, either making metaphysics, really complicated, or sort of changing the topic, or something like this. So, because on independent grounds, I think that there are logical possibilities of gluts and logical possibilities of gaps. You have these options. Every science has them, theology has them, everyone who's after the truth has them. But theology has rarely actually explored this. And so I actually think that it's the right account of the incarnation is to say that Christ is a contradictory being, some predicates both true and false of him. Anyway, yeah, so getting away from details.
Well, just examples of, I just want to give some examples of such predicates.
Sure.
Classical theists might say something like timeless and not timeless, or temporal, let's say. They might say impassible and passable. And then non-classical theists would definitely say like, oh, well, perfect and imperfect, or impeccable and peccable, and all these other sorts of things. Necessary and contingent, right? Contingent because he's fully human, and humans are contingent and created and temporal and so on. Whereas necessary and perfect and so on, because he also has he's also fully divine. He has a divine nature. So yeah, just wanted to get that.
That's exactly right. And in fact, I think the some of these are stamped at some of the like, I think of standard Christian theology as up through the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Maybe it goes a little beyond that, but that's where I think really the definitive theory of the incarnation and Trinity are. But interestingly, while some of those councils say things like Christ is mutable and immutable, and as you said, impassible and passible explicitly, they don't say anything about explicitly, they don't say peccable and impeccable. But interestingly, theologians for a long time have pointed to, peccable and impeccable as a key example of the tension between Christology, that is theory of Christ from above, and Christology from below. And the basic tension is, if Christ isn't human and peccable, then, like, if Christ is impeccable, that is, could sin, how is that human? Like, how is that human the way we are, the way the tradition affirms? Nobody's saying Christ sinned, but could. And then from above is like, well, of course, Christ couldn't sin because Christ is divine, and so on. And you should one day go through some of the ways of trying to resolve it. They always tilt one side or the other. I actually think that this is a great example of why the contradiction is motivated. Yes, human, just like you, could sin, didn't, but could. Right, divine. It's false that Christ could sin. I mean, it's a contradiction. But if you only tell one side, you're leaving out an important part of the truth. So I often think of it as, before the incarnation, everyone, all theists affirm the existence of, all monotheists affirm the existence of one God. And thought, okay, God is, perfect, great, all this stuff, good, at least the Jews, Muslims, Christians, all very, well, I guess, sorry, not Christians yet. They all thought God has all these great features. But then the incarnation comes as a special revelation, according to Christian theory, and revealed the falsity of those as well. So you get the full story. Namely, it's true that God is omnipotent. That was known before the incarnation. But now, after the incarnation, you know that it's false that God is omnipotent. Or for any of these. Before the incarnation, it was clearly known that God is impeccable, couldn't sin. After the incarnation, we learn, okay, God could sin because Christ is God and Christ could sin. How do you make sense of temptation and all this stuff? Okay, so that's the sort of story. I won't go into the details further, unless you want, but.
And Joe, just a quick note too. I mean, just the simplicity of this solution compared to the other solutions on offer alone is worth the price of admission. I mean, it's just so elegant and simple that it really, if nothing else, deserves serious consideration when you look at sort of all the metaphysical and epistemological hoops that need to get
gymnastics,
yeah, exactly.
You got to spell out. I mean, a lot of them you have to almost spell out like a metaphysical semantics, and then that's going to be ontologically committing you to either maybe tropes, maybe concrete natures, maybe these other things that might even be metaphysically suspicious on independent grounds.
Exactly.
And you just have to. It's like you're building this elaborate tapestry, and it's like. I mean, and something that JC points out is the history of heresies is precisely because they recognize the contradiction and they want to resolve it some way. So they're like, okay, let's dial down the divinity a little bit, or let's dial down the humanity a little bit, things like that. So,
well, and what's interesting, and this will get into, I'm sure, what JC is going to talk about next, but sort of JC follows Bart in the sense that, we got to start with the incarnation to tell us the truth about the Trinity. And so we go through the incarnation to reveal more about what God is like. And, I don't know, JC, you could tell me, I don't know the literature as much as you do, as well as you do, but it seems like people have their own account of the incarnation and solution for that, and then their own metaphysics and epistemology for the Trinity. And they're totally separate from each other, where it's like, well, wait a minute, maybe they, another thing that's really, I think a check in favor of JC's account is following Bart. It really, the incarnation lets us into more information about the Trinity, and you have the same sort of solution that allows for both to make sense. So I don't know if you want to use that as a segue, JC, or if Joe, if you want to take it, but that's just another point.
I think that's a good segue into the Trinity thing. So.
Yeah. So, and again, the two distinctive doctrines of Christian theology are the incarnation and the Trinity. And theists, both Christian and non-Christian theists, atheists, agnostics, everyone has always pointed to both of these things and said they sure look contradictory, and unless you're equivocating or doing this or that. And I think that in light of the longstanding contradiction, appearance of contradiction. Both of these naturally motivate a contradictory account. As Mike said, I think that, you know, there's a strong tradition in Christian theology where, you know, the revelation, the incarnate revelation was not taking away truths about God. It was adding to them. And that's where you get the doctrine of the Trinity and so on. Okay. Well, it might seem obvious. I mean, for people who haven't taken the time to think about logic, to think about philosophy of logic, to actually to work on some of the details, it may look like, well, if you're just calling Christ a contradiction, why not call the Trinity a contradiction, and that's fine. Well, I would not be interested in that. Like, I'm not interested in just sort of like on the surface. The details matter deeply, and it's not obvious how the contradictions of Christ affect contradiction in the Trinity. And my follow-up book on the Trinity, which is called Divine Contradiction, tackles what's called the logical problem of the Trinity, which is the apparent contradiction of Father, Son, Spirit, each of whom is identical to God, none of whom are identical to each other. There's tons of work by this, but from my colleague Mike Ray has done a lot of work on this, and other people. But, you know, I point out that the so-called logical problem is really a problem of identity. You have to identify the identity relation in those axioms. Father is identical to God, Son identical to God, but Father not identical to Son. What is the relation? And the book spells that out. And it does so in a way that retains the standard, absolutely standard recipe for identity, which is the Leibnizian recipe, which I spell out in the book. So yeah, and in the end, you get a very natural account of contradictions in the Trinity that explain how it is that Father, it's just false that Father is identical to Son, but it's true that both Father and Son are identical to God. Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, without going into details, it's a little bit hard, but as Mike said, look, these are the two central doctrines. And many accounts of the so-called logical or fundamental problem of the incarnation give one answer, and to the so-called logical problem of the Trinity, give a completely different answer. But on the surface, they look like it should be a unified answer. I don't have an argument that it must be, but it does on the surface look like it should be. Relative identity theories do give a unified answer. The problem is, as far as I can see, and I point out in the book, they all crash. They're all trivial. That is, all the relative identity theories treat relative identity relations as equivalence relations, reflexive, symmetric, transitive. And they just crash into the trivial theology. So all of these theologies are just, they contain every sentence in the language, which is not, you know, that's hard to accept. Yeah, so I'm not sure how much more you want me to say.
Yeah, so Mike, I'll let you interact with him because you're kind of in the weeds here. So I'll let you guys go back and forth a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's really, one of the reasons, so I'm writing, you talked about how, so I'm doing my PhD on the foreknowledge and freedom problem. And that is true. But what I found, what I'm more interested in were these two models, Anderson's model and JC's model. And the reason being, and this is my own personal story, is prior to this, these two reading about and learning these two models, I was sort of outside of the fold when it comes to Christian orthodoxy. Like I held to a sort of modified modalism that said, well, no, God is just, one being, one center of consciousness, and manifest in three forms, the Sabellian sort of heresy. And I was like, oh, I'm fine with being a heretic because this is clearly contradictory, right? It's like, and everything I see to try to make sense of these things, these two, well, specifically the Trinity, it just, my goodness, I love Brian Leftow, and I thought I really like his sort of solution. But when you look at what he has, again, what he has to do to try to make sense of this sort of Latin Trinitarian model with time and all this stuff going on, it's just, I was like, okay, I'll just go ahead and say that maybe the church fathers weren't right on this one. But when I read the scriptures and look at it, this is clearly contradictory. We can't have contradictions. And so we gotta adjust this. But then, Tyler McNabb, who I wrote the first paper with, he said, look, you can't be living like this. You're a heathen. He's like, you gotta figure this stuff out. And so he pointed me in the direction of Anderson's work and JC's work. This was 2 or 3 years ago. And I read the two models and thought, yeah, no doubt. This I can totally get back into the fold and be called, one of the brethren, So I guess it's just a little aside, but that's why I find this stuff so interesting, is because of the impact it's had on my own walk, my own life. And again, the Trinity model, you can correct me if I'm wrong, JC, but the presentation is a bit more technical than the incarnation. Maybe not technical, but it takes some. I had to read the chapter 3 or 4 times, but once you get it, again, just like the incarnation, the elegance and the simplicity, it just is like that light switch turns on. It's like, oh yeah, no, wow, that is just incredible.
Yeah, I think part of the reason is that it's the problem is slightly more technical, in that the problem really is one to precisely specify the relation that underwrites these axioms. Right. By the axioms, the Athanasian axioms, as I call them, Father is God and so on. Right. So, the project itself calls for a little bit more precision and maybe not more precision, but more sort of technical stuff, because the standard account of identity is one that, the Leibnizian thing is basically a schema where you have, phi of x, if and only if phi of y, if for all phi that biconditional holds, then the two get to be identical. But of course, what biconditional? What biconditional is involved there? It can be, the recipe allows for any ingredient you want, you'll get a different identity relation.
Right.
And a lot of people working on this stuff just assume there's one identity relation, which is again an unfortunate effect of not having the opportunity to look at logic a little bit more in depth, the philosophy of logic and so on.
Right. Your M principle, I mean, and that, again, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, JC, but just what you're talking about, even if you're not sold on the sort of subclassical solutions, JC's books are great because you get the sort of bare bones logical presentations of the problem, right? And it's like, JC talks about the M principle in your new book, JC, where to be divine and to be God is in all places intersubstitutable, right? Is that it was just like, just to read that.
X is divine and X is God.
Yeah.
Those two things are intersubstitutable in all non-intentional.
Right there. It was like, oh yeah, wow. That, so just that alone was like, yeah, I've never thought of it like that, but that's exactly right. So you get this sort of logical bare bones presentation of the issue. And so I think anybody working on the problem, again, even if you don't agree with, dropping to a lower account of logic, you have to start here if you're going to build a solution and I to these problems. And I think, like JC was saying, a lot of theorists will assume a lot of stuff, and then they put forth the solution, and it's missing certain things because they haven't sort of got down to the basement level and fleshed out the problem the way JC has. And so that was really helpful to me too, to just see the problem formulated with that logical presentation. It brings out a lot of the nuances of the mechanics going on.
Yeah, and I will say too, it's amazing how I've looked at other areas in philosophy of religion and so forth, and the assumptions in the background, not only about classical logic, but the assumptions about conditionals and identity. It's as if, okay, there's the logical material conditional, and then you can modalize it to get something more,
right?
And that's that. And it's like, I mean, that you're basically looking at the tiniest corner of the sort of uncontroversial space of conditionals out there. And it's really, I think, it no fault to anyone. It's part of just the way, education and things go right now. But it's really limiting in ways that I think a lot of good theorists don't realize the options.
Yeah. Joe, I want to talk to you about this. And this kind of goes back to the first section, but it just, the response to JC's work has been interesting. And obviously there's been some good pushback that I think has been really helpful. But, as philosophers, we theorize some of the craziest stuff. I mean, it's like we talk about conscious subatomic particles and simulations and Platonic realms and, all these different things, modal realism. And then you get into philosophy of religion and Christianity and analytic theology, and you've got dualism, and you've got heaven and hell and angels and demons and all of this, God incarnate dies, 3 days later he rises and then ascends into heaven. I mean, just sort of crazy stuff, not unjustifiable, right? I mean, I believe in a lot of those things, but like clearly not your day-to-day stuff. But then, especially within the philosophy of religion world, and I don't know if this is just because the LNC does so much work in our dialectic, but then you postulate sort of the subclassical solutions and put those forth, and everybody's like, whoa, wait a minute now. Let's not get too crazy. So it's like, well, why? Well, and then you ask, well, why not? Well, I just don't like that. I just don't like, I mean, again, there's been good pushback, but a lot of the pushback is, oh, I just don't like, I like things being consistent. It's like, wait a minute, we posit all this other crazy stuff. Like, why is this so radical? So I don't know, Joe, I mean, especially again, within the POR world, I'm just wondering why there's been so much like, this is such a radical thing. But then let me go ahead and talk to you about dualism,
Yeah. I mean, I guess one explanation, I'm not sure if it's like undergirded by phenomenal conservatism, but so phenomenal conservatism for the audience is the view roughly that if it seems to one that P, then one has a kind of defeasible reason for thinking that P, and seemings can come in, it's kind of graded, so you can have like it's very strongly seems to me to be the case that P,
right.
that could very strongly justify you in thinking that P, absent some super strong countervailing considerations. Right. That is actually implicit in a lot of philosophy of religion and so on. Like a lot of people, and I mean, I find it plausible as well. And so a lot of people just kind of accept that and work with that. And I'm guessing, again, this is just a hypothesis, but I'm guessing that a lot of people in the field, perhaps you can give a debunking explanation for this, people
right.
have grown up and been enculturated in the kind of classical logical sphere and so on. But a lot of people in the field, I think, they just have this very, very, very strong, perhaps even unshakable seeming of the truth, the necessary truth of the law of non-contradiction. They just,
Right.
it seems to them that no, there just can't be a true contradiction. And so they think that the bar is so exceedingly and overwhelmingly high to sufficiently counteract that strong seeming that they almost think it's like impossible to be able to do that.
Right.
And so that's my kind of explanation. And I mean, with respect to these other crazy things, they might say, yeah, it's crazy, but not as crazy as the contradiction. I'm
Right.
guessing that's what they'll say. Or they might say, we do have this sufficiently countervailing considerations in those cases, like, I've got this really good argument for dualism or whatever, for modal realism. Whereas they might say, by their lights, they don't have a sufficiently strong argument for taking on true contradictions. As
but they do all that while carrying two obvious things. One, no good argument for the account of logic that they have. And two, they walk around as if there's one principle of non-contradiction. I mean, what is it? Tell me what it is. I mean, maybe it's valid logically. For example, there are subclassical paraconsistent logics according to which it's false that P and not P is a logical truth. For example, one of the well-known subclassical paraconsistent ones, that's actually a logical truth. In the what's called the dual of K3, which allows for the failure of excluded middle. So, I mean, people walk around with these sort of, without actually reflecting on what they're even saying. And as I've said in other contexts, sure, I mean, I'm sort of, you know, I think of the dual of Cartesian foundationalism as simply, you know, you're justified in what you think until you have good reason to reject it. Whereas, you know, the dual, the Cartesian foundationalist says you have good reason to reject everything until you have, or you should reject everything until you have good reason to accept it.
Right.
And in fact, I'm sort of on the dual of Cartesian foundationalism. I think, yeah, justification is really easy. But whoever said that the pursuit is justified belief? No, the pursuit is truth. And when you know that the phenomenological feel of something can be affected by eating a bad breakfast, like, I don't know. I just think, come on, like, nobody should be asking whether you're justified. Like, who cares? And two, nobody should care if they do. What they should care about is whether what you say is true, what you believe is true. And again, many people thought that parallel lines could never meet. This is just so phenomenologically strong. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Well, that you haven't engaged with the recalcitrant data that pushes back on it.
Yeah.
You just haven't engaged.
Yeah, I think I like that analogy. It's a good analogy because, like Kant, for instance, thought it was like this a priori knowable truth that like space is Euclidean and, like things like that. Like people in the past thought it was so utterly inviolable and so self-evident, but it's like, nope, non-Euclidean geometry comes along and like, oh crap, and now we know like that space-time itself is definitely not like how Kant thought it was and so on. So
and do you know how that happened? That happened because logicians were realizing, look, there are all these entailment relations and so on. And if you underwrite Euclidean geometry by this, then you get a different thing. And it just turns out that, lo and behold, that theory that arose from just reflecting on what entailment relations can be like and so on, and playing with axioms, lo and behold, that's actually true of reality, something else other than what was so phenomenally strongly seeming to be right.
Yeah. All right. So for the last maybe 15 minutes or so, we can talk about the problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. So I will turn over to you, Mike. What is this problem, firstly, and then how do you go about, how do you go about like solving it, as it were?
Yeah, this is a really fun problem. So JC's dealing with the core Christian doctrines, right? But if you sort of abstract out a bit and you look at just sort of general monotheism, like I said, one of the most prevailing and longstanding issues has been the foreknowledge and freedom problem. And so quick, just simply put, I mean, I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with it. I recommend them back to one of the episodes you did on it, which you laid out some of the mechanics of the actual theological fatalist argument. It's fantastic. I don't know if you remember what episode it was, but you did a great job.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was the one on, I was going through one of Linda Zagzebski's papers. Is that what you were thinking of? Yeah, that was really fun to do.
Yeah. And then there are a lot, and then you did a great job because there's a lot of technical ingredients and mechanics, and you have some interesting operators, right? You have this accidental necessity and this transfer principle. You have a lot going on, but the basic idea can be laid out pretty simply, right? So just like JC's working with axioms, I'm trying to work with axioms as well, though the pushback is much greater in this sense. Like JC said, it's not as clear that these are hard and fast monotheistic commitments, but generally a number of theists have thought two things that in regards to this problem. One, that humans have free will, and free will conceived as the ability to do otherwise. Maybe not at all points, not every decision, depending on your what your metaphysics of freedom is. But that in order for a free creature to be considered free, especially in the sense of moral responsibility, blameworthy, praiseworthy, things that are obviously incredibly important for theists, in order for that to be the case, an agent would need to have the ability to do otherwise at certain instances. So tomorrow, I'm going to lift weights in the morning, and I might decide between, we always talk about coffee and lemonade and what you're going to pick for breakfast. I think we should need to talk about the important stuff, and that's working out. So tomorrow I'm going to.
Yes, I'm with you.
Yeah, you got me. Yeah. Let's talk about some bench press and some hang clean. So tomorrow I'm going to decide between, bench press or hang clean. And let's say tomorrow comes and I get down there and my back's bothering me. I say, I'm just going to go for a run with JC. He's smarter than I am. He knows not to get crazy. Let's go for a run. And so the ability to do otherwise would say, in that situation, it was the case that I generally could have picked either bench press, hang clean, or going running with JC. That those were all live options. That there was nothing that forced me to choose one. And I if we reround the tape and everything was the same, leading right back up to the same decision, I could choose hang clean over going for a run. And so free will is the ability to do otherwise. So sometimes called leeway, freedom. That's the free will that causes the most tension within the theological fatalist argument. So I think it's Vissens and Kittle wrote an Elements book, and they had a great quote in there about, if this account of freedom can be shown to be compatible when placed within the foreknowledge and freedom dilemma, then whatever your account of freedom will work, because this is sort of the strongest account. So that's one axiom. Freedom has the ability to do otherwise in certain instances, and those are the instances under consideration. And then divine foreknowledge, so that God knows what's going to happen in the future. God, not only what's going to happen in the future, but he knows what future actions future decisions free creatures will make, right? So tomorrow, God knows what lift I will choose to do in the morning. So you take those two, those are axiomatic. God has infallible knowledge of the future. And this is just sort of an extension of omniscience, right? So we can think of foreknowledge as that subset of God's knowledge that entails beliefs about the future, right? True beliefs about the future, future free actions, and that human beings, creatures have the ability to do otherwise. So tomorrow I'm going to choose between bench press or hang clean. And let's say from the creation of the world that God knew at the creation of world that tomorrow I would choose to bench press. If the past is fixed, right? So there's nothing I can do to change the fact that God had that belief at the creation of the world. And God's beliefs are infallible. So God can't be wrong about, what's going to happen in the future. Then it seems like there's nothing I can do tomorrow but do what God knew I was going to do at the creation of the world. And so that, I don't know, Joe, you probably know this thinking problem better than I do. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, another way to put it is like, well, let's suppose that you did have the ability to do otherwise than what you in fact will do tomorrow.
Yeah,
well, then it seems as though you'd have this really weird backtracking power to somehow bring it about that God had a different belief all along billions of years ago. It's like, what? That, the past seems to be fixed. Like, there's no use crying over spilled milk. Like, right. So, and like, it's over and done with. It's in the past. It's there. It's gone. You can't do anything about it. Sorry, Bucko, as it were. So, like, if you did, so you get this kind of absurd result. If you suppose that you have the ability to bring it about that you do something different tomorrow, namely, you have the ability to bring it about that 13 billion years ago God had a different belief, and it's like that seems sketchy.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so this is a problem that we've been dealing with for a long time, right? Obviously, in its Christian form, all the way back to Boethius, and then you can talk about just sort of the parallel problem of logical fatalism, going back to Cicero and Aristotle and all that. So this is something that we've really been wrestling with. So for the sake of time, I'll just lay out the two solutions that I put forth, one with Tyler McNabb, and then this one that goes off of JC's model.
Yeah, and just to quickly intervene, with respect to time, we've probably got maybe 7 or so more minutes, and then we'll close this out.
Okay, yeah, so just real quick, so Anderson's model, and I'm sure, Joe, you deal with the classical theist stuff, so you're used to an appeal to analogy. So long story short, Anderson's model, Anderson proposes this epistemological solution to the Trinity and incarnation problems by saying, look, these look contradictory, but they're axioms in the theory, and we're going to stick with classical logic. So this must just be an apparent contradiction. And we're not in any place epistemically to say what's going on, but there's some sort of equivocation going on. We don't know where it is. Here, Anderson gives some possibilities on where it could be, but ultimately, given that God is incomprehensible, and that, especially for the classical theists, our predications of God are analogical in most cases, we can say, well, we don't have all the information, but we know these are axioms. And so if I believe that God is 3 and God is 1, and each of those beliefs are independently epistemically justified, then the apparent contradiction need not rise to the level of defeat for holding those two beliefs. We can hold those two beliefs and have a reason to say, well, no, they're apparently contradictory, and there's something going on behind the scenes there. There's a lot of different elements to it, and I would just butcher it. But here's the quick quote from the paper that I thought when I was talking with Tyler that sort of motivated this idea. And here's the quote. It's in the conclusion. It says, "The problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom lies at the intersection of various philosophical and theological issues that are themselves arguably far from settled. Within the canon of the literature devoted to the problem, one will find work focusing on causality, dependence, omniscience, the nature of God, semantics, epistemology, free will, determinism, divine knowledge." And so, you just got so many things at the intersection of this problem that every solution is going to need to account for. And within their own walls, they're unsettled, right? These different metaphysics and epistemology. And now you're working on a problem that's at the intersection. So it seemed like that was a way to motivate, well, we can appeal to analogy here, and we can be justified in doing so, given everything that's going on. We can say, well, this is a paradox, and that's cool. We're epistemically justified. Check out Anderson's work. I know JC's a big fan. JC really respects Anderson's work. Now we'll get into JC's model, where JC, and I love it. I don't remember if you talked about this in your book, JC, but JC will say something along the lines of, Anderson comes right to the precipice of the truth, right? So the first half of Anderson's book, he's talking about how contradictory the Trinity and the Incarnation are, but then he says, but ultimately they can't be, and sort of turns away, where JC says, no, you're there, just accept it as is, and let's drop this sort of dogmatic embrace of classical logic. Let's consider weakening our underlying account and allowing for the phenomenon to fit in our theory as is. And I thought that was really interesting, because if you buy JC's model, which I do, you have this God that's in all these places contradictory, right? You have all these contradictions on the divine side of things. And I just thought, if you look at it from a theological anthropology, or, created in the image of God, it just seems weird to me to think that God would be in all these places contradictory, but our world and us as human beings would be totally consistent, right? And so the idea is, well, okay, let's explore what the divine foreknowledge and human freedom problem would look like under JC's model. Now, it does get in, so because of that, you have this, so the simple solution is this. God does have foreknowledge. And because God has foreknowledge, we don't have free will. On the truth of God's foreknowledge, humans don't have the ability to do otherwise. But the opposite is also true. It is false that God has foreknowledge. And on the falsity of God's foreknowledge, it is true that humans have the ability to do otherwise. And so you have this sort of contradictory entanglement between God's foreknowledge and human freedom. Now, JC's problems, if you look at how Eugen categorizes these problems as sort of, Eugen Nagasawa categorizes them as type A, type B, and type C paradoxes. Type A and type B paradoxes, without getting into all the details, are just paradoxes that arise on the divine side of things. Type C paradoxes are ones that arise with divinity and contingent humanity. And so the foreknowledge and freedom problem is one of those paradoxes. And what I talk about in the paper, and what's interesting about the solution, is subclassical solutions to these type C problems end in this entanglement, where you have this, this truth and falsity with one of God's properties and with human properties. And so that's what now I'm exploring in my PhD, is sort of what that looks like semantically, and how that all works out. And I know JC is not on board, because what happens is you do seem to get all these glots, right? At least on the face of it, every time we ascribe freedom to a human actor, that is now both true and false. And so the key for me going forward is, how do we parse that out in a way that maybe limits some of the gluts? So I don't know, Joe, that was a ton, bro. I tried to get it in.
It's great. And, I'd love to be able to interact with this back and forth, but unfortunately we are a little bit cut for time. So yeah, no, it's great, because we had to go through that stage setting at the beginning. So, and I think it was valuable. And the conversation also was just amazing as it stands. So, that's gonna have to do it for time. And I'd love to be able to go back and forth on it, like I said, but unfortunately we won't. Now, I know you did have a final word to say, Mike, before we cut it out.
Yeah, Joe, I just want to tell you, man, we talked about football, and I just want to give you some praise, brother, because I know how hard it is to get to the top of a discipline and how much work goes into that. And I also know how much harder this world of philosophy is, especially spending time with JC and him, getting to see somebody at the top. And I just want to give you credit, man, because you're incredibly humble and generous, and yet you're badass, bro. Like what you're doing as a junior in college, I'm blown away, man. Absolutely blown away. So I just want to tell you, I just respect the heck out of you and everything you're doing. And it's really been an honor to be on the show. So thank you, man.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. And it's wonderful coming from you, my dude. So, and I've really benefited from your work. So, and both of your guys' work, of course. I read The Contradictory Christ, and I'm like, oh, this is great. I really enjoyed it. And I've listened to basically all of JC's appearances on the Analytic Christian and Capturing Christianity. I'll link some of those in the description, and I will also link both of their work in the description. So I guess I'll just thank you guys both for coming on. And what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is the Majesty of Reason, and peace out. Okay, so let me just stop the recording, and then we can say a final word.